General Dwight Eisenhower said Andrew Higgins won World War II. Not with tanks, not with planes. With a boat the Navy called swamp trash. On D-Day, 80% of Allied landing craft were his design. The admirals who mocked him had to watch his boat save the world. This is how a Louisiana boat builder with zero naval training outsmarted the entire United States Navy and changed warfare forever. June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the English Channel. 156,000 Allied troops are about to attempt the impossible, storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. The fate of the free world depends on getting these men from ships to shore alive. And the vessel carrying them? A flat-bottomed boat that Navy admirals spent years calling glorified garbage. Thousands of these craft are cutting through the waves toward Normandy, Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, Gold, Juneau, Sword. In every single one sits 36 men who don't know if they'll live to see sunset. The boats hit the sand at full speed. Bow ramps drop. Soldiers pour out onto French soil. This moment, this invasion, this turning point in human history, all depends on a design the military establishment tried desperately to reject. The man who built these boats wasn't an admiral, wasn't an engineer from MIT, wasn't even from a coastal city. Andrew Jackson Higgins ran a lumber company in the swamps of Louisiana, and the Navy brass absolutely hated him for it. But here's what they didn't understand. Sometimes the answer to an impossible problem doesn't come from the experts. Sometimes it comes from someone who never learned what's supposed to be impossible. Sometimes it comes from a stubborn, loud-mouthed businessman who built boats for trappers and bootleggers. Someone who looked at the Navy's million-dollar failures and said, "I can do better with plywood and a prayer." This is the story of how American military bureaucracy almost lost World War II by being too proud to listen, and how one man fought a two-front war, one against the Axis powers and one against his own country's admirals. Before Andrew Higgins changed warfare, he was just trying to move lumber through swamps. New Orleans, 1930s. Higgins owned timber operations deep in the Louisiana bayou. Dense cypress forests, shallow waterways, mud that could swallow a truck whole. The problem? Getting logs from forest to mill when there were no roads, and the water was barely ankle deep. Traditional boats were useless. They had deep keels that extended below the hull, designed for real water, real depth. Put one in a Louisiana swamp, and it would ground out in minutes. The propellers would chew through mud and vegetation. You'd be stuck, and in bayou country, stuck could mean dead. Higgins needed something different. He studied Japanese sampans, flat-bottomed boats that could float in a puddle. He obsessed over how they moved through shallow water without getting hung up. He started sketching, building, testing. His first attempts failed, then failed again. He burned through his own money, convinced there was a solution if he could just find it. What he eventually created was the Eureka boat, flat bottom, no keel. The propeller sat in a semi-protected tunnel that let it run in 18 inches of water without destroying itself. The boat could drive straight up onto a mud bank at full speed, load or unload, then reverse back into the water. It was ugly as sin and violated every principle of traditional boat design. Naval architects would have laughed it out of the room. But it worked. God did it work. The trappers loved it. Oil drillers in the bayou bought them. And during Prohibition, the rum runners absolutely adored them. Fast, maneuverable, could hide in water so shallow the Coast Guard couldn't follow. Higgins didn't advertise that last part, but he didn't exactly discourage it either. A sail was a sail. Andrew Higgins himself was as unconventional as his boats, self-educated, hot-tempered, foul-mouthed. He'd get into shouting matches with customers, with suppliers, with his own employees. He didn't have a degree in naval architecture and didn't pretend to. What he had was an intuitive understanding of physics, water, and what actually worked versus what looked good on paper. He also had perfect timing. Because while Higgins was building swamp boats in Louisiana, the United States Marine Corps was 3,000 miles away, trying to solve a problem that would define modern warfare. The problem was this: how do you invade a beach? Sounds simple. It absolutely wasn't. Traditional naval strategy avoided the problem entirely. You captured ports. You landed at harbors. You didn't try to drive ships directly onto hostile beaches because that was suicide. Troops would have to wade hundreds of yards through surf while enemy machine guns cut them down. Casualty projections for amphibious assaults ran 50 to 80%. That wasn't a battle. That was a massacre. But by the late 1930s, the Marines knew harbor invasions wouldn't be enough. War was coming. The Pacific theater would require island hopping, taking Japanese-held atolls that had no ports, just beaches. Europe would eventually require a massive amphibious invasion. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was urgent. The Navy's Bureau of Ships started designing landing craft. These were serious vessels built by serious naval engineers with serious credentials. They were heavy, made of thick steel, expensive. Each one cost upwards of $50,000. They required cranes to load and unload troops. They were slow, unwieldy, and required a dedicated crew of trained sailors to operate. And they didn't solve the fundamental problem. The boats still couldn't get troops to shore quickly, still couldn't reverse off a beach under fire, still left men exposed and vulnerable for far too long. The casualty projections barely improved. What the military needed was this: a boat that could carry a full platoon, run at speed in shallow water, drive directly onto a beach, drop a ramp so troops could exit in seconds without getting wet, then reverse back into the water before enemy artillery could zero in. It needed to be cheap enough to build by the thousands, and simple enough that any sailor with basic training could pilot it. And it needed to be ready yesterday because war was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The Navy's response? Keep refining their expensive designs. Keep adding weight. Keep adding complexity. Keep insisting that proper naval vessels required proper naval engineering. The Bureau of Ships had careers and reputations invested in their approach. Admitting they were on the wrong track wasn't an option. Then, in 1938, a Marine Corps officer on a procurement tour happened to be in New Orleans. Someone mentioned there was a local boat builder making interesting shallow water craft. The officer went to take a look. And there, sitting in a warehouse in Louisiana, was something that made him stop and stare. Andrew Higgins was happy to talk. Hell, Higgins was always happy to talk. He showed the Marine officer his Eureka boat, demonstrated how it could run right up onto shore, explained the protected propeller design, described how trappers could load supplies, push off with a pole, and reverse back into the swamp. The officer started connecting dots. What worked in a bayou might work on a beach. What moved lumber might move Marines. Higgins saw it too, and Andrew Higgins was never a man to miss an opportunity. He made a modification to the design, adding a bow ramp that could drop down for easy exit. Suddenly, you had troops who could ride all the way to shore, stay dry, and deploy in seconds. This wasn't revolutionary naval architecture. This was applied common sense from a man who'd spent years getting boats in and out of tight spots. The Marine Corps ran small tests. The results were promising enough to get Navy attention, and that's when things got ugly. The admirals at the Bureau of Ships looked at Higgins' boat and saw an insult. This civilian, this businessman with no formal training, no connections to Annapolis, no respect for hierarchy, thought he could waltz in and solve a problem the Navy was working on. With a swamp boat? The audacity was breathtaking. The design was offensive. Everything about it violated naval tradition. Flat-bottomed boats were inherently unstable. Everyone knew that. They'd flip in ocean waves. The Navy had 100 years of institutional knowledge saying this couldn't work. And here was some loudmouthed Louisianan claiming otherwise. The technical term the admirals used was unseaworthy. The unofficial term was swamp trash. The Bureau of Ships blocked procurement contracts. They refused to conduct official tests. They spread word that Higgins was a civilian profiteer trying to scam the military. They doubled down on their own designs, which were proper, Navy-approved, built by proper shipyards with proper credentials. Never mind that those designs kept failing basic performance requirements. They were the right kind of failure. Higgins's boat was the wrong kind of success. Andrew Higgins did not take rejection well. Where a smarter businessman might have backed off, tried diplomatic channels, played politics, Higgins declared war. He built boats with his own money, then invited military officers to come see them work. He leaked test results to newspapers. He went directly to Congress and told representatives that Navy brass were going to get Marines killed through sheer stubborn stupidity. He called admirals desk sailors who've never heard a shot fired in anger. None of this made him popular in Washington. The Navy brass wanted him blacklisted. They wanted him investigated. They wanted him gone. What they didn't want was to admit he might be right. 1941. The Navy could no longer avoid a direct comparison. Too many Marine Corps officers had seen Higgins's boats perform. Too much congressional pressure was building. The Bureau of Ships agreed to competitive tests off Norfolk, Virginia. Navy designs versus Higgins. May the best boat win. The Navy was confident. Their boats were built to specification, engineered to standard, approved by committees. Higgins was bringing a modified swamp boat. This would be a formality. They'd prove him wrong, then get back to serious work. The tests began. Rough seas, combat loading, beach landings, reverse extraction, speed runs, durability trials. The Navy's boats struggled immediately. They were too heavy, too slow. They couldn't handle the surf. They grounded out too far from shore. Loading and unloading took too long. In rough seas, they swamped. Under stress, mechanical systems failed. They weren't just underperforming, they were catastrophically bad. Higgins' boat performed flawlessly. It handled rough water like it was born there. It ran up onto the beach at full speed. The ramp dropped. Troops deployed in under 30 seconds. The boat reversed off and was ready for another run. It was faster, more reliable, more stable, and easier to operate than anything the Navy had built. And it cost 1/4 the price. The Navy couldn't dispute the results. The data was too clear. The performance gap was too wide. Higgins had just humiliated the entire Bureau of Ships in front of military leadership. And he'd done it with a boat that naval engineers said shouldn't work. Then December 7th happened. Pearl Harbor. America was at war, and suddenly theoretical debates about landing craft became life or death urgent. The military needed thousands of these boats, and they needed them now. The Navy swallowed its pride and gave Higgins the contract, but they never forgave him for being right. Andrew Higgins now faced a different kind of impossible, going from prototype to mass production overnight. Building landing craft at a scale and speed that had never been attempted. He had months, maybe a year at most, before those boats would be needed in combat. Failure meant dead Marines and a longer war. No pressure. Higgins Industries transformed into something resembling controlled chaos. He built massive assembly facilities in New Orleans. He hired anyone who could hold a tool: women, black workers, elderly men, disabled workers. In 1940s Louisiana, this was radical. The segregated South didn't approve. Higgins didn't care. He needed workers, and he needed them now. His factories became some of the first integrated workplaces in the region. He studied Henry Ford's assembly line innovations and took them further. Boats were broken into prefabricated sections that could be built simultaneously, then joined together. Parts were standardized so field repairs could use components from any boat. Every process was analyzed for efficiency. How fast could wood be cut? How quickly could sections be welded? Where were the bottlenecks? Fix them. Speed up. Do it faster. The numbers became staggering. At peak production, Higgins Industries employed over 23,000 workers. They were completing a new landing craft every 90 minutes. 700 boats per month rolling off the lines. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By the time the war ended, Higgins had built over 20,000 landing craft of various types. The LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, became the iconic version. 36 troops or a jeep plus 12 men, made primarily of plywood, powered by a simple diesel engine. Could be built by semi-skilled workers, could be operated by sailors with minimal training, could take battle damage and keep running. The design was so good that other manufacturers were brought in to build Higgins boats under license because one factory, even running at maximum capacity, couldn't meet demand. Higgins also developed variants. The LCM, Landing Craft Mechanized, could carry a 30-ton tank. He got into PT boat production, the patrol torpedo boats that would become famous in the Pacific. Every design followed the same Higgins philosophy. Make it simple, make it work. Make it fast. Make it cheap enough to build by the thousands. And through it all, Andrew Higgins kept fighting with the Navy. They'd change specifications. He'd ignore the changes if he thought they were stupid. They'd send inspectors. He'd argue with them. They'd try to impose procedures. He'd find workarounds. The Navy wanted control. Higgins wanted to build boats. The tension never ended. But the boats kept coming. Because the war was waiting, and the war didn't care about hurt feelings or wounded pride. Guadalcanal, August 1942, first major American offensive in the Pacific. The invasion required landing 11,000 Marines on a hostile island held by Japanese forces. The landing craft carrying them? Higgins boats. The operation worked. The Marines got ashore, established a beachhead, and began the long, brutal fight to take the island. Without those boats, the landing fails. Without that landing, the entire Pacific strategy collapses. The island-hopping campaign that followed used the same playbook. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Every single one required amphibious assaults against fortified positions. Every single one depended on getting Marines from ships to beaches quickly and under fire. Higgins boats were in every wave, every invasion, every operation. General MacArthur said it directly. The Higgins boat made every Pacific battle possible. The Pacific theater proved the concept. The European theater proved the scale. North Africa, November 1942. Operation Torch, first major American ground combat against Nazi forces. Over 100,000 troops landing across 300 miles of coastline. Higgins boats carried them in. Sicily, July 1943. Operation Husky, the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that point. 160,000 troops, 3,000 ships, Higgins boats hitting 7 different landing zones simultaneously. The Italian campaign. Salerno, Anzio. More amphibious operations. More Higgins boats. The design had gone from swamp trash to the backbone of Allied amphibious capability. Every operation refined the tactics. Every landing taught new lessons. By 1944, the Allies had turned beach invasions from suicide missions into executable strategy. Then came D-Day, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, June 6, 1944. Everything the Allies had learned, every tactic they'd developed, every boat they'd built, all focused on one objective: put 156,000 troops on 5 beaches in Nazi-occupied France and establish a foothold for the liberation of Europe. The scale was incomprehensible. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, troops from America, Britain, Canada, months of planning, years of preparation. The entire outcome of the European war balanced on whether those men could get from sea to shore and survive the German defenses waiting for them. 1,500 Higgins boats hit the beaches in the first wave. 1,500 flat-bottomed plywood craft that admirals once called unseaworthy. They cut through channel waters. They dodged obstacles and mines. They took machine gun fire and artillery shells. Some sank, some exploded. Some made it through and kept coming back for more runs. At Omaha Beach, where German resistance was strongest and casualties were highest, Higgins boats kept delivering troops wave after wave. Men died on those ramps. Men died in the water. Men died on the sand. But they kept coming, because the boats kept running, because the design worked even under the worst possible conditions. By the end of D-Day, all 5 beaches were secured. The impossible had happened. The Atlantic Wall was breached. And when historians calculated the numbers, they found that over 80% of all Allied landing craft used in the invasion were Higgins designs. The boat the Navy tried to reject had just delivered the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The irony was almost too perfect. The most important naval vessel of World War II wasn't a battleship, wasn't an aircraft carrier, wasn't a destroyer or cruiser or submarine. It was a 36-foot plywood boat designed by a civilian who'd never been to Naval Academy. It cost less than a Jeep, and it changed the outcome of the war. Hitler himself recognized it. German intelligence reports called the Higgins boat the new weapon which has given the Allies superiority. Not tanks, not planes, not some secret technology. A simple landing craft that solved the problem of how to invade beaches. That was the weapon that broke Nazi Europe. After the war, Eisenhower made it official. Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Coming from the Supreme Allied Commander, that statement carried weight. Higgins had gone from rejected contractor to war-winning designer. His boats had carried millions of troops in over 200 amphibious operations. 90% of Marine Corps beach landings used his craft. Every major Allied invasion from 1942 to 45 depended on his design. The casualty rates for amphibious operations, once projected at 50 to 80%, dropped dramatically. Not because beaches became less dangerous, but because troops spent less time exposed. They got from ship to shore faster. They deployed quicker. They could retreat and regroup if needed. The Higgins boat didn't make beach invasions safe, but it made them survivable. And in warfare, survivability is the difference between a calculated risk and a suicide mission. By the numbers, the Higgins boat might be the most cost-effective weapon system ever deployed. 20,000 craft built, millions of troops transported, entire campaigns made possible. And each boat cost roughly $2,000 in wartime prices. Compare that to a battleship at $100 million. Compare it to any other weapon system. The return on investment wasn't just good, it was unprecedented. But Andrew Higgins didn't get a hero's welcome in peacetime. When the war ended, military contracts dried up overnight. Higgins Industries had 23,000 workers building boats in 1945. By 1946, the company was bankrupt. Peacetime had no need for landing craft. The factory closed. The workers dispersed. The assembly lines that had produced boats every 90 minutes went silent. Higgins tried to pivot to other products. Pleasure boats, commercial craft. Nothing caught on. The business failed. He'd become wealthy during the war and lost it all after. In 1952, Andrew Jackson Higgins died at age 65, largely forgotten by the public and still despised by sections of Navy leadership who never forgave him for being an outsider who outperformed them. The Navy never awarded him the Medal of Merit despite repeated nominations. The official reason was bureaucratic procedure. The unofficial reason was that admirals have long memories, and Higgins had embarrassed too many of them. He died without official recognition from the institution he'd saved from its own incompetence. It took decades for his reputation to properly recover. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, his hometown, made the Higgins boat a centerpiece exhibit. Military historians began ranking it among the top innovations of the war. Eisenhower's quote kept circulating, reminding new generations what Higgins had accomplished. The man who'd been called a civilian profiteer and swamp boat peddler was slowly recognized as one of the most important industrial designers of the 20th century. The question is why? Why did the Navy resist so hard? Why did it take a war to force them to accept what worked? The answer is painfully common in large institutions. The Navy suffered from "not invented here" syndrome. If it didn't come from their designers, their engineers, their approved process, it couldn't be trusted. They had procedures, they had hierarchies, they had proper channels. Higgins ignored all of it and made them look foolish. There was also class prejudice. Navy officers came from Annapolis. They had degrees and pedigrees and proper credentials. Higgins was a businessman from Louisiana who built boats for trappers. He wasn't one of them. He didn't speak their language. He didn't respect their authority. Accepting his design meant accepting that an outsider with no formal training could outthink their entire bureau. That was unacceptable. Institutional inertia played a role too. The Bureau of Ships had invested years and millions into their designs. Careers were built on those projects. Reputations were staked. Admitting they were on the wrong path meant admitting wasted time, wasted money, wasted effort. It meant someone would be held accountable. Better to double down and hope the problem solved itself. And there was fear. Fear of being shown up. Fear of losing control. Fear that if one civilian could redesign landing craft, what else might the military be getting wrong? Letting Higgins succeed opened doors the Navy wanted kept closed. Easier to reject him and maintain the illusion of institutional competence. The cost of that resistance was measured in years. Years spent developing boats that didn't work. Years that could have been used perfecting the design and training crews. If war had come even 12 months earlier, the Allies might have gone into amphibious operations with fundamentally broken equipment. The casualty numbers would have been catastrophic. Entire invasions might have failed. The outcome of the war could have been different. That's not speculation. That's what nearly happened because an institution couldn't admit an outsider was right. What let Higgins succeed where others failed? He had no formal training, which meant he had no assumptions about what couldn't work. He focused on practical problem-solving instead of theoretical perfection. He was willing to fight bureaucracy instead of working within it. And he had stubbornness that bordered on insanity. Any rational person would have given up after the Navy rejected him the first dozen times. Higgins kept pushing, kept building, kept proving them wrong. He outlasted their resistance through sheer force of will. His approach offers a template. When you know you're right, prove it through demonstration, not argument. Build the thing, test it, show the results. Make the evidence so overwhelming that even hostile institutions can't ignore it. Don't wait for permission. Don't expect recognition. Do the work and let performance speak. The Higgins boat is a reminder that simple solutions often beat complex ones. Naval engineers were adding weight and systems and complexity. Higgins stripped everything down to core functionality. Carry troops, hit beach, drop ramp, reverse out. That simplicity made the design reliable, cheap, and fast to produce. Complexity can be impressive. Simple can win wars. It's also a reminder about innovation and where it comes from. Breakthrough ideas don't always originate in laboratories or defense contractors or institutional R&D departments. Sometimes they come from swamps. Sometimes they come from people who aren't supposed to have the answers. Sometimes expertise is the enemy of innovation, because experts know too many reasons why something shouldn't work. The modern world is full of institutions making the same mistakes, companies rejecting ideas from outsiders, governments doubling down on failed approaches, organizations protecting reputations instead of solving problems. The bureaucracy that nearly cost the Allies the war didn't die in 1945. It just changed addresses. And somewhere out there, right now, there's probably another Andrew Higgins. Someone with an idea that could change everything. Someone being told by experts and institutions that they're wrong, that they don't understand, that they should leave it to the professionals. Someone fighting a system that's more interested in protecting itself than finding solutions. History says we should listen to those people, or at least give them a fair test, because the next time someone shows up with a swamp boat, it might just save the world. D-Day succeeded because 36 feet of plywood and a bow ramp put boots on sand. Because a loud-mouthed businessman from Louisiana was too stubborn to accept no. Because sometimes the greatest innovations come from the most unlikely places, built by people who never learned they were attempting the impossible. The admirals who called it trash had to watch it win the war. And that might be the most satisfying vindication in military history.